Welcome back, everybody. We're into Module 1, Lecture 3, and we're looking at stakeholder theory. There's been some reading this week that's a bit different from your textbook reading. It's because we don't talk about stakeholder theory in the textbook. We've selected this as a suitable theory from the management literature to underpin this course. So there are two articles we've asked you to read that are sitting there under the module reading, waiting for you, and they're accessible through the library site. So I hope you've read them, or at least you're going to read them very, very soon. What do we cover today? We're looking again very briefly at the practice learning problem, and then we're asking why we would use stakeholder theory. We define stakeholder theory and its various elements, and we look at some key points that come from your readings. Again, being a relatively short lecture, we can't touch upon everything in your readings, but we at least skim the surface there, and it's up to you to look at the detail. We look at some schema that have been developed for stakeholder theory, and we try to apply that to social media. And then, as we do each week, we raise a few discussion questions that I'd like you to examine on the discussion board. Well, let's just have another quick look at that learning problem. I won't read through it in detail, but it's important for us to consider it in the context of each week's classes. So this was to do with a person working in a government department, and it was discovered that this person was actually tweeting anti-policy messages under an anonymised Twitter handle. So last week when we looked at the various elements of the law as they affect social media, elements of social media policy and so on, you would have been thinking about this problem and how it might apply. And that is where our questions arise. And you'll see from last week and this week that there's some relevance to our practice learning problem because the questions relate to the legal issues that are arising, but also introduce stakeholder theory and its elements, and how stakeholder theory might apply to a particular social media problem that arises in the workplace. So I hope you've been on that discussion board and have been discussing some of those questions and sharing views with your peers and with me there on the discussion board. Well, why would we have stakeholder theory in a course on social media? Well, firstly, we need to think of why we'd need a theory at all to underpin the course. And you've got to remember that this is a postgraduate course. And universities aren't just about telling you what to do and what not to do, giving you the basic facts of something. You also need to think about that in a theoretical context. And we decided that stakeholder theory had enough about it that really wed with the material we look at in social media. So it gives us a framework through which we can look at social media laws and the ways they might apply in organisations and might feed into the policies and how those policies and laws might impact upon all sorts of stakeholders that are involved with an organisation. So that's why we've chosen stakeholder theory. It fits well with the management, it comes from the management literature and matches up well with our course. Well, what is stakeholder theory? And your two readings this week give various definitions. I particularly liked this one from the Financial Times lexicon. Stakeholder theory suggests that the purpose of a business is to create as much value as possible for stakeholders. In order to succeed and be sustainable over time, executives must keep the interests of customers, suppliers, employees, broader communities, and shareholders aligned and going in the same direction. Innovation to keep these interests aligned is more important than the easy strategy of trading off the interests of stakeholders against each other. Hence, by the management of stakeholders, executives will also create as much value as possible for shareholders and other financiers. So that definition tells us a few things. it's stemmed pretty deeply in the business and management literature. You can see a strong capitalist side to that. But I would suggest that it shouldn't just apply in those sorts of corporate organisations. I think it's a healthy thing to be thinking of the implications for all sorts of stakeholders, also in other organisations. So what are the key elements of stakeholder theory? It's a theory of organisational management and ethics. Ethics is a key element here, addressing moral values as a central feature. Addressing morals and values, moral values, morality and values as a central feature. So it's not just that we should enhance the benefits of customers or shareholders or line the pockets of company directors. There is an ethical obligation on us to do the right thing by all stakeholders in the broader community as well. And stakeholder theory provides a framework by which we can identify stakeholders, perhaps more than just in those central groups already mentioned, and prioritise their interests and help inform our decisions. So let's look at your first article by Phillips, Freeman and Wicks. What stakeholder theory is not? It sounds strange coming at something by telling you what it's not. Let me assure you, and those of you who've read the article will see it does also talk a lot about what stakeholder theory is. An important point here is that the co-author there, R. Edward Freeman, is a real guru in this area, and we've managed to source a presentation by Freeman about stakeholder theory, explaining a lot more, over an hour, of the basic elements of stakeholder theory. And that's sitting there on your Learning at Griffiths site in your video section as well. So if you are particularly interested in stakeholder theory, go and look at Freeman's presentation about that. Well, coming back to the article, the key points that I found there, and you may have some more that you can suggest on the discussion board. There are distortions out there about stakeholder theory. People seem to have twisted and bent this theory to suit their own interests, the authors seem to be saying. They stress the moral foundations of stakeholder theory. So it's important that we understand that ethical or moral dimension to it. They stress the attention of stakeholder theory to non-shareholders' needs. It's not just keeping the shareholders happy, delivering them a dividend each year, but it's about how does the company sit in an ethical way within the broader society. You can apply that just as easily to a government department, some other agency, a sporting association, or your own university. Stakeholder theory emphasises the maximising of value from a corporate decision, not just maximising the wealth that might emanate from it. And as we all know in our own lives, some of the most valuable things are the things that don't cost us very much. Perhaps it might cost us tens of thousands of dollars for an overseas holiday, but the thing we value more might be a walk with our partner or family in the bush nearby. That doesn't cost us really anything at all. It distinguishes from stakeholder society. And what it's doing there is it's saying, while we might generalise this theory to some slightly different organisations than the company, stakeholder theory is not meant to be a theory, a moral theory, a set of values applying to all of society. So it's not very easy to apply stakeholder theory to some larger social problem, such as immigration or the environment and a government's policy there. It comes down to smaller organisations, and that's how we look at it with social media terms. And they also say that social media is more organic in its nature. It's not a cut and dried thing. It's not a linear process. It's not all that predictable in how it's going to play out. One thing grows from another. It has an organic element to it. Your second article by Crane and Rubottom is Stakeholder Theory and Social Identity, rethinking stakeholder identification. Now, this cuts to one of the key aspects of stakeholder theory, and that is identifying who the stakeholders might be. And as you saw from that first definition I showed you, there have been some fairly narrow ideas on stakeholders, and it comes down to typically a company and its directors, its customers and its shareholders. But this article argues that stakeholders can be much more complex than that. They might not be defined just by their generic economic function, such as a shareholder or a customer, but there's a need to define also the social identity of stakeholders, because while they might fall into one of those economic groups, they might have shared interests with perhaps other people on some other dimension of what the authors call social glue, social cohesion. So, for example, the managing director of a company is a keen sports player. Perhaps they like Formula One racing. It might also be that one of the employees, perhaps the cleaner, is a Formula One racing enthusiast. And it could be that the company is making an important decision to do with sponsorship in Formula One. Well, the social glue that actually binds the managing director with the cleaner in that situation is their combined interest in, their shared interest in Formula One racing. So what the second article proposes is a model whereby we could integrate social identity with economic roles and in some way combine these so that when we're looking at stakeholders, we consider more than one dimension, not just their economic role, but perhaps what other social glue applies in that situation. They give critiques of what they call the hub and spoke approach. The company or the organisation at the centre of stakeholder theory, and the stakeholders being out on some spoke, like a bicycle wheel, out on the extremes. Now, what they're criticising is this model, this traditional model of stakeholder theory, where that company, you can see the company there in that diagram that I've sourced from Wiki Commons. The company is at the centre, and there the internal stakeholders are there, the external stakeholders are there, but you can see they are all spokes on the wheel of the company. Now, the driving question here is, can we adopt this or adapt this in some way to social media? If we come back to the article by Crane and Rubottom, they proposed, and I wouldn't expect you to be able to read the finer detail here in this graphic, you'll need to go to the actual slides that are stored there on the site to read this, but I think you'll see it in the article itself. What they do, this schema they have, actually has down the main columns the actual traditional role, but along the side columns it has roles that add to their social role, the social cohesion, and it asks us to map the stakeholder according to both their traditional role and their social role. Now, this could actually have some application to your learning problem, the practice learning problem you're doing at the moment. Maybe the employee working in the government department has a role as an employee there, as a communications officer, but maybe we're talking with that employee's interest in the environment. As an eco-warrior, we're talking about an element of their social involvement, their social cohesion. And it could be that that's one aspect of it that we can explore in our analysis of it to see whether that's a misfit and how that might feed into our social media policies as we consider the needs of stakeholders. So our learning questions drill down into these important areas. How well do the schema pictured on those earlier slides suit an application to social media risk? Who would be the key stakeholders in the design of an organisation's social media policy? Who are the stakeholders in a lawsuit over an offensive tweet that's been posted on Twitter? Which aspects of stakeholder theory best suit the analysis of social media risk. You've seen a few aspects there now in those two articles. Which parts lend themselves best to social media law and those risks? And why should moral values play some role in assessing social media risk? So in review, let's look at where we've been today. We've introduced you to stakeholder theory. So we have this lens through which we can consider social media law and risks and policies. We've learned there are different approaches to stakeholder theory, and you'll find that in academic material, of course, that for every academic there's a different spin on a particular theory, a different approach, and there's debate over its value and application. Where are we heading? We're moving on to Module 2 next week, where we'll examine social media laws in more detail. We'll start with defamation, which is one of the big ticket items in social media law, and then we'll look at special laws of the court and how the courts themselves as an institution are adapting to social media. All the way we'll have stakeholder theory as the backdrop to our discussion. Meanwhile, get working on that discussion board, discuss these topics this week related to stakeholder theory and how they might apply particularly to our practice learning problem. Write up your learning journals for the module and read the next text chapter to do with defamation and social media. I hope you're enjoying this. I certainly am.